These colors are so vibrant. Oh, I think this one's gonna look really good. This effect is definitely one of my favorites. Have you ever tried to create vibrant colors using stain only to end up with a mess? I'm gonna share with you the products and techniques I use to create these vibrant colors so you can create some stunning pieces of your own. Adding color to your wood projects is nothing new, but to achieve these vibrant, deep colors, the product you choose will make a huge difference. Today, I'll show you how I mix and apply Keda dye, as well as showcase the techniques I use to get this gator eye effect. Keda dye is an environmentally safe stain powder that's made in the USA. This kit comes in 5 different colors: red, yellow, black, brown, and blue. Blending these colors will create more variations. It's recommended to use a 1/4 teaspoon of powdered dye to a 6 to 8 ounces of either warm tap water or 70% alcohol. Rubbing alcohol will evaporate faster and reduce the raising of the wood grain. Adding more powder or liquid to the mixture will lessen the dye, but adding more powder may not darken the dye. To achieve a deeper color, more coats are recommended. After the dye is completely dissolved, check the color of the dye before applying. The color of the dye does not always represent the color it will be on the wood's surface. Mixing 2 dyes together will give you a wider range of colors like greens and purples. Keda dye is the preferred dye among many DIYers and professionals because of its quality. Unlike other products, these dyes are meant to be blended together. Because of this versatility, you can create some of the most stunning effects using endless techniques. Before applying the dye, you want to make sure that your surface is always prepped correctly. It's recommended to prep your surface with 150 grit sandpaper. A higher grit sandpaper will tighten the grain and won't allow for penetration of the dye. After prepping your surface, it's recommended to soak the top of your project with warm water to raise the wood grain and then resand after it's dried. This will ensure for the best penetration of the dye without raising the wood grain on the final product. To apply this product, I like to cut up a shop towel into about 2-inch sections. For this project, I'm going to use yellow and green dye. Because our kit doesn't come with the green dye, we're going to be mixing our yellow and our blue together, and we'll create that green ourselves. I've found making green can be a little bit difficult, and the best way to achieve a perfect green is to start with a light blue, add a lot of yellow, and then slowly bump up the blue until you get the darkness of the green that you like. For this project, I decided to start with a lighter green and work my way up to a darker green rather than go too dark too soon. For this design, I'm going to start with a heavy yellow in the center. I've found when working with yellows or lighter dyes and trying to blend between a dark and a light color that it's best to place down your lighter color first, really saturate the surface and try to dye that wood. That way when you come back over with a darker color, the middle or the lighter section will be less susceptible to the darker dye. After applying a heavy coat of yellow to the center, I then switch rags and begin to work out the hard line with just a pure alcohol, blending all the way towards the edges, making sure I don't have any dry spots. Throughout this process, it's important to remember that you have patience, that you work with the layering effect, and that you always remember your surface will look different when it's wet or has a clear coat and when it's dry. The difference between a professional looking product and a DIY product is the amount of time you spend saturating the surface. To achieve a vibrant design, it's going to take several coats and a lot of blending. As you begin to apply just pure alcohol, you'll see that the surface will change and it'll become darker, but that's just because the surface is wet. Once the surface dries out, you'll begin to see the true effect start to take place. Our goal for this part of the project is to make sure we blend out any of the hard lines and just focus all of the yellow in the center. After our first coat dried, you can see that we're able to saturate the center of this board really well with the yellow dye and have no harsh lines or unnatural looking edges. For our second coat, we're going to repeat our first coat. We're going to apply a deep yellow to the center and slowly begin to blend it out. Between each coat, I like to wait at least 15 minutes. Rubbing alcohol helps reduce the dry time as opposed to water, but between each coat, I still give 15 minutes, and for every 3 coats, I like to wait at least 2 hours. After our second coat, we got a deeper yellow and no harsh lines once again, but I knew that we needed to add a third coat just to be safe. Throughout the process, I'll continue to add more yellow to the center so this color will get even darker. But for now, I just want to make sure that I have the center of this board completely saturated. That way we once again reduce any of the blending or the darker green that could come into that center. For our next coat, it's time to start adding in a little bit of green. After I laid down my first light coat of green, I realized that I wasn't recording. So as I add my second coat of light green around the edges, you can start to see the effect really take shape. It was about here that I realized I need to go a little bit darker with the green. I'm glad that I went light just so that I could find out that right tone, but definitely going to need something a bit darker to really saturate this edge. After about 15 minutes, the project dried out and I could see that the green was still just a little bit too light. But I wanted to make sure I let the project dry out completely overnight at this point before I come back tomorrow and start again. After letting the project dry out overnight, I came back and I decided I wanted to go one more time with this lighter green just to see if that it needed another coat or I really needed to bring in some more pigment. When applying this green, my biggest worry is bringing anything towards the center. We're going to blend everything slowly, but we want to make sure that we don't have any green overlap this yellow and really ruin this whole project. We've done a pretty good job of saturating the center, so we shouldn't have too much penetration from any other color dye, but we do want to make sure that we keep this green as far away from the center as possible. As I apply this green around the edges, I try to make sure that I use the same rag and soak up as much moisture as I can and move it around until it begins to dry out. Then I'll switch to a drier rag and then start to buff each one of those edges and those harsh lines, working my way towards the center. After I use a dry rag to absorb any of the dye that's left over, you can see that there's still a pretty harsh line in the center. To reduce this line, I'll come back in with a pure alcohol and buff left and right so that there's not such a sharp contrast. The last thing I like to do before I let this layer dry out is come back with the yellow in the center and slowly work my way out. Adding yellow dye will keep the center of this project vibrant, but it'll also help dilute any colors that may have come too close. Rather than using a diluted pure alcohol that may strip away some of the colors, using the yellow dye will help keep those colors while still blending those colors. As I begin to work the yellow dye out, you can begin to see that there's a little bit of green that starts to come out with it. So I then switch to a dry rag again and buff all of that green dye outwards. After the second coat of green, I realized that a lot of blue pigment was being seen, so I decided it was time to bump it up to a higher pigment green to not only cover those blues, but to really help speed up the process and saturate the surface. Working with this darker pigment, we could certainly find ourselves with a mess really quickly, so we want to make sure that we blend from our edges and slowly work it towards the center. Even though I'm working with the darker pigment, I still want to put in more layers to help saturate this surface, so I'm making sure that I stay as far away from the yellow as I can and work my way up to it. After working for a few minutes with the dye and letting it penetrate into the surface, you'll begin to see that a lot of the moisture dries out and the rag becomes a little bit dry itself. I then switch the rags and try to suck up any more of the moisture that there is before I start blending anything towards the center. To finish up, we'll do exactly as we did on our last coat. We'll take our yellow and put it back in the center and use it to help dilute any of our harsh lines, working our way outward.
This looks pretty good. I'm liking what I see. I'm not too worried about these dark spots. Once we put a clear coat on it, it should all blend out really nicely.
I've tried many different finishes with this dye and they all work. But for this project, I'm going to use a spray enamel. Using a spray finish will help avoid blending any of these lines together, and an enamel will dry quickly to a crystal clear finish. Before you go, let me know in the comments below, what color combo should I do next? And don't forget, the best way to support me is to like and subscribe. We just passed our first 1,000 subscribers.